Good.
Dante.
Brad, how much do you know about Dante?
Good question.
Okay. So I put together some notes for the history because I feel like there's some important backstory, and a lot of it has to do with the political context in which it was written and like Dante's specific political experiences.
I don't really know anything, I would say.
Basically, Dante was born in the 1200s in Florence. And at the time, Florence was like a big deal, both in terms of like political power and economic power. And there were a lot of like merchant families and a lot of agricultural families and a lot of people, they were like patrons of the arts. And at one point, Dante had like his own patron that was paying for him to be a writer and poet. Basically, Dante was born in Florence and he was like super into Florence and loved his city and was like very invested in politics at the time and like very focused on like the good that politics could do. And it was also like super Catholic all the time, everywhere. So there was like a lot of hotly contested debate between like papal authority and the Holy Roman Emperor. And so some people thought that like the Pope was like like the be all and end all, and the Pope should have the most power, and the Pope should be able to veto anything that the Emperor does. Some people were like, well, the Pope is like in charge of spiritual matters, but he shouldn't have any say over anything that happens here on Earth. And the Holy Roman Emperor should be able to do like whatever he wants and have free reign and get as much power as he wants and do whatever. Some people that were like, the Pope should be able to have control over some things and the Emperor should be able to have control over some things. But basically the way that it works was both of their power, according to politics at the time, comes directly from God. So the Pope gets his power bestowed directly from God. That's where all of his power comes from. You have to listen to him because that basically means you're listening to God, and he's like God's mouthpiece. Holy Roman Emperor is basically appointed by the Pope. So the Pope gets to say like, all right, you get to be the emperor right now. And there's a lot of like really shady political stuff going on with like who gets appointed emperor and who, whatever. And like at the time, often the Pope came from like a rich family, and it was like kind of like if you have a president who's like really rich and kind of thinking about his own interests, even though he's not supposed to when he's acting and making political decisions for the whole country sort of thing. What that boils down to is like the emperor, when he's appointed, has to kneel to the Pope because the Pope is the representation of God on earth. But the Pope, after appointing the Holy Roman Emperor, has to kneel to the emperor because the emperor is also a representation of God's like power on mortal affairs. There was like a lot of back and forth, and like the Pope did not want the emperor to have too much power because then he could like seize the papal lands, and the emperor did not want the Pope to have too much power because he's like, hey, that's my job, like don't take all this land from me. And like on top of that, the emperor also generally was already a king, like already came from somewhere, like it would be like the king of Germany or the king of Sicily or whoever, and like would already have like familial lands and title and stuff, and was emperor on top of that, and theoretically did not like cross those two positions, but they did. So anyway, there were two main factions in Italy, which was not Italy until 1860. So basically until the mid 1800s, Italy did not exist as a country. It was just like a bunch of different territories, and they were all like did not want to be the same part of the same thing. But at this point, they were all part of the Holy Roman Empire, and they were like, well, we're all kind of our own city state, but like technically we're under the rule of whoever the emperor is at the time. So there were the Guelphs, and Dante's family was a Guelph family. And they generally came from merchant families. So they were generally like wealthier trading families. And they generally supported the Pope and said that the Pope should have more power and should be able to like put some checks on the emperor, because they saw the emperor as like taking way too much power, taking way too much land, like stepping beyond his bounds as like a servant of God. And then there were the Ghibellines, and the Ghibellines were like, well, we think that the emperor is like should have power over whatever he wants to have power over because he's God's like person on earth, and so he should be able to decide whatever happens, whatever he wants. So at some point, the Guelphs, which was Dante's faction, kicked the Ghibellines out of Florence. They went in exile, and they were like, you're not allowed here anymore. And then it was just the Guelphs. But then they started breaking off into factions, and there were the Black Guelphs and the White Guelphs. The Black Guelphs felt like the Pope should be able to take more power and have more control. And the White Guelphs, of which Dante was one, thought that there should be balance in these things, and that basically the Pope should be able to have a lot of power and power over like daily life and things like that, whereas the Emperor should be able to have power over lands and politics, and that those two pieces should be separate. Long story short, the white Guelphs won for a while. They kicked the black Guelphs out of Florence. And then the Pope basically was like, hey, no, I don't like this. I want more power. So he got all his friends, like he got his friends from France, and he got a bunch of like mercenaries to come with him. They come in, take over the city, and then kick out the white Guelphs. And they're like, hey, Dante, I don't really like what you did to like make sure that I didn't get more power. So we're accusing you of political corruption and charging you an enormous, ridiculous fine. And Dante was like, bro, I didn't do that. That's ridiculous. I'm not ever going to admit to that because I have more principle than that. And I'm never going to admit that I committed fraud. And then they're like, all right, then I guess we'll burn you at the stake. And he was like, or I could just leave. And so he left for a while, and he basically spent the rest of his life waiting for things to settle down in Florence and waiting for things to kind of go back to a peaceful place where he would be able to return to his homeland that he was like deeply, deeply fond of. And he never did. He died of malaria in Ravenna in exile and like never got to go back to Florence. And it was super sad. And he was sad about it all the time. And the Inferno was basically written while he was in exile and was like, you know, this sucks.
I hate this guy. I hate that guy.
Inferno for him is an allegory for his life and an allegory for kind of searching and trying to get back to the paradise of Florence. But it's also an allegory for the political state in Italy at the time, like wanting things to go back to a peaceful place in Italy because he cared so much about his country and he cared so much about things being right and just. And he just wanted things to be good so that people could have a guide. So when it comes to Dante's political opinions, he basically said that like people need a overarching government to be happy and to be successful. It's kind of like having the head of a company or like having the father be the head of a family. And he thought monarchy was it. And he was super into monarchy. And he basically said, 1, monarchy is necessary for people's well-being. 2, people are ruled directly by a monarch. So the people's actions should be ruled by the emperor. And 3, the monarch derives his power directly from God. So he shouldn't be answering to the Pope on what the Pope thinks that he should do. He felt that people required both spiritual guidance. So like they required the Pope to be like, here are the things that you need to do for your soul to be saved and for you to, you know, to be a good example for what people should do in order to get into heaven. And then also the corporeal guidance. He said that basically people require peace and unity in order to be happy. And it's the job of an emperor to unite everybody, to bring peace to everybody, and to put them in line if they're not going to be peaceful. And he said that when humanity is united, then they're basically in God's image as like one unified thing. And he thought like basically both needed to be in balance, and he wanted to make sure that they were not trying to usurp each other's roles. And he felt that like when the Pope would like come in and go out and murder people and take their land and like build on the papal lands, it kind of like goes against the idea of his spiritual purity and his spiritual example. But like if the Holy Roman Empire decided to like tell people when they should go to church and how they should be living holy lives, then it would like kind of all fall apart too. A couple more things. So there's 2 important people. There's definitely a lot of important people in the Inferno from like history and literature, but the first important person that we're actually going to meet tonight is Virgil. Roman poet. He wrote about Aeneas. One thing that is really important to know going in is that like Aeneas basically spent time in exile traveling. Virgil's poetry was basically a comfort to Dante while he was in exile. He offered wisdom and he offered guidance, but he didn't really offer much in terms of hope or, you know, an ability to like overcome the political turmoil or overcome fate. And it was basically like, yeah, other really smart, cool people are in exile sometime too. I don't know what to tell you about that, but hope it works out.
And just like add something small to that, like since Virgil died before Jesus, Virgil was bound to be there. So he really had no way out and he had no conception of what heaven was. So he was only like, hey, Dante, you look at all this messed up stuff. Virgil was supposed to represent like the true basic moral and ethics that people have without the church's imposition of them. And one of the reasons why, I guess, like, I don't obviously know this, but the way we talked about it was that Dante chose to have Virgil there not only is because Aeneid is similar to Dante's journey, that he could relate to it and actually use it as like Inferno is in some ways a fan fiction of it. To him, represented the humanist movement that was coming up in the Renaissance, and this is pre-Renaissance. Dante is pre-Renaissance. So Dante's rebellion of the church standard is actually the birth of humanist ideology, and like as you said, like separating the spiritual guidance and corporal guidance. So Virgil was actually supposed to be a very good representation of the corporal guidance that people should have on their own life.
I want to mention that Aeneas is the guy who we talked about in the Where Are They Now episode of the Iliad, who found his way to Italy and then had the prophecy that he was going to eat his tables, and then found out that that was just pizza, because that's what they eat in Italy.
In addition to all the super smart stuff Murat said about kind of what Virgil represents, he also kind of represents the tension between like classic philosophy and classic literature and modern as of the 1200s thought, and then also that tension between logic and religion. So Virgil was like very wise and very logical and very smart, but like no matter how smart he is, he's never going to be able to be saved because he can't like logic his way into
being born after Jesus. You can't logic your way into that.
And then the other important person who doesn't really show up in the Inferno but is mentioned, so it's important for us to kind of know who she is Beatrice. Dante and Beatrice met when they were both 9 at Beatrice's dad's house, and Dante like started simping hard.
Simping.
But simping is such a perfect description of what happened, because Dante just like idealized her and fantasized her and was like writing her letters all the time, and they were like in courtly love, which was basically Dante being like, you're so beautiful, you're so amazing, like everything's perfect about you, I bet you're gonna get into heaven for sure because you're like this like saintly pretty lady.
Pretty lady. In I guess it's called The New Life, whatever it is, like the book that came after. There's a scene where Beatrice does not say hello back to Dante at like a very normal day. Dante's like going to the shop or something, whatever he's doing, and Dante gets crushed. He's like, he writes like a very long poem about she didn't respond to me saying hello to her. My soul is in a dark, dark place. I want to die. It's like, oh my God.
He's literally just like, notice me, senpai, but senpai is Beatrix. So anyway, Virgil basically is Dante's guide through the Inferno and through purgatory. But he's like, well, I can't go into heaven because them's the rules, but Beatrice is going to show up to like take you there because she's like obviously in heaven. He died at 25, so she was already dead by the time that the Inferno was written, and she had been dead for maybe like 15, 20 years at that point. That kind of wrecked Dante. So Dante writing the Inferno, and well, he wrote the Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. So it's basically he like, we'll talk more about this in the chapter, but he goes like through hell and then goes up through purgatory and then climbs like up into heaven. And it's like, for him, I think it kind of gave him hope and inspiration that like, well, even if I die before Italy's unified, like there's still hope. Like it's a slow progress. It's not something that's going to happen overnight or in my lifetime. Or like it could happen in my lifetime, but maybe just not now. And
that's 700 years.
Yeah, I would still argue that like Italy's government does not necessarily like live up to Dante's hopes and dreams for the country.
Definitely not.
Well, he wanted monarchy, right? So
there we go.
I mean, he wanted monarchy, but above all, he wanted like earthly guidance to bring everybody to salvation. And you know, like we're not necessarily requiring that everybody be Catholic now, so that's not really gonna happen. Other important facts: this journey takes place on Good Friday into Easter, so it's like 3 or 4 days. Like it starts on Good Friday and goes through the Easter whatever. The number 3 was really important in the Inferno and in Catholicism.
In literature.
Yeah. It's like the three faces of God, like God,
Mhm.
Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, heaven, hell, and purgatory, 3 days before Christ was reborn on Easter.
When is it the original Easter? Like during his journey, is it like he's transported back in time? It's kind of okay.
No, it's basically like, it's kind of a little bit like in A Christmas Carol where Scrooge goes on this like 3-day adventure with ghosts in the middle of his life. Basically, Dante at the time was like in his 40s, but he implies that it was like when he was like in his mid 30s that this happened, that he like journeyed through hell and all this stuff happened. So because of that, he says it happened like 5-10 years ago. So he peppers in like these little predictions throughout the story that like come true, but they come true because they already happened when he wrote them.
I can see the past.
Yeah. And then the other really important and very, very cool thing about the way that the Inferno and the whole trilogy was written is that it's written in terza rima. Basically, each stanza has 3 lines. The rhyme scheme is ABA, BCB, CDC, and it continues on like that throughout the entire piece, which is really incredible. Definitely easier in Italian than it would be in English, but it is really, really cool. It was written in like a vernacular style, so it was like very much spoken Italian, but it is like a little bit like, it's understandable to modern Italian, but it's not the same.
It's close.
Yeah.
It's close.
Would you say it's like a Shakespeare to modern English, or would you say it's more like a Beowulf to modern English?
It's more like Shakespeare to modern
Shakespeare,
English.
closer to
Yeah,
Shakespeare.
for sure.
Back then, a lot of these words definitely had different meaning, and especially different weight, which kind of makes them like,
Yeah.
reading through, you're like, what are you even on about? But then you're like, oh, I see, that's what that means to them. Like, one thing to add to that rhyme scheme is that was also a rhyme scheme that was really used, like similar type of rhyme scheme was used in old Arabic literature, like Quran style, like Sufis literature. And I don't really know exactly why that rhyme scheme happens to be the popular pop rhyme scheme, the new sensation rhyme scheme of the time, but like usually religious texts.
It's just like intricate and cool, and like 3 is important in many the number 3 is important in many religions, but it's also just like, damn, it's cool that it's like so interlocking like that, and it kind of like gives it a forward momentum that's really interesting. But it really makes sense because a lot of Italian culture was influenced by Middle Eastern culture, because it kind of came to Italy by way of like Sicily and Naples, because especially Sicily was occupied a lot.
Yeah.
And Sicily was also like a huge seat of like artistic and literary, like, you know, exploration. And there's like this huge court of like Federico II that was like, you know, people just like hung out there and wrote poetry and made art and wrote stories and just like advanced art and literature.
Just like art island, like it was actually really cool.
Yeah, and Sicily was occupied by like Spain, they were occupied by France, they were occupied by Germany, they were occupied by like every country in the Middle East.
Everyone just went through Sicily. It's like, oh, let's see what's that's about.
It's just like out there in the middle of the sea. So they're like,
Oh,
oh, that was good. It's got lots of like oranges and lemons. We like those.
We love those.
I wonder, and you may not know this, but there's a lot of like fan fiction, so to speak, that becomes semi-canon in Christianity, at least, like Paradise Lost and Seven Deadly Sins, and like even Revelations is supposedly like political commentary. So I don't know if you know, like, do you know when people started taking this seriously?
I mean, he took a lot like from the Bible, but he also took a lot of liberties and like fleshed it out. But I don't think it took very long, you know, and I think a lot of it was like sure, that makes sense. But he put a lot of thought into like where different sins would be on hell and what their punishments would be and how hell was structured, and like a lot of that was his own like beefs that he had with people, but he put a lot of like his enemies in the book. It's really funny. Also, like a lot of our current perception of hell is that it's like all full of flame and lava and brimstone. Like most of hell in the Inferno is cold. Like in the book, a lot of it is icy and cold and not fiery.
See, that's one thing that's kind of cool, where like in the Inferno, which is the way I guess the basis of our imagination of hell, those aspects of hellfire, these demons, were all symbolisms, and they had purpose to being there. Like fire wasn't just all over hell, but fire was there specifically to torture a certain kind of person.
Yeah.
So I feel like the modern image of hell kind of lost a lot of that and kind of sensationalized the scarier aspects of hell.
I would imagine that comes from Greek mythology, though, with like the flaming river Styx, and like they had fire in their afterlife, and so like Greek myths inspired so much of our modern understanding, and like it's probably a combo. But yeah, it is weird. Like when hell freezes over, it is supposedly already happening.
It's already kind of frozen over.
It's just like fiery lake of burning sulfur is what they say, and like you would be crying out for even someone to have a drop of water on your tongue.
Purgatory in this is like fire. Virgil at one point is like, I'm going to show you people that are screaming in pain, and I'm also going to show you people who are on fire, but they're cool with it because they know they're going to heaven eventually. This was Dante's like diagram.
Plan.
Each of these different circles, it's basically like a giant funnel, and there's like it's like goes around like a spiral, and each different level is a different sin, and then they're grouped by like the highest ones are in incontinence, which is like it includes things like jealousy, luxury, avarice, things like that. And then like down here, this section is violence, and it's separated into like violence against people close to you, violence against yourself, and violence against nature and the arts, which includes bestiality and sodomy and usury. So that's a cool opinion. Fraud against people who don't trust you, and then in this circle, it's fraud against people who do trust you, which given everything that we said about like Dante being blindsided by the Pope was basically like, hey Dante, come hang out with me at my Pope house, and Dante was like, okay, but like why are you asking me to come to your Pope house? And he was like, just trust me. And Dante was like, okay, I want us to have peace, I'm gonna come to your Pope house, and I'm gonna talk it out with you so that like you can be chill with Florence being awesome. And then while Dante was off at the Pope house, like he wasn't even there yet, he was like on his way, all these people came in and like kicked his party out of Florence, and he was like, come on man. So that's why like fraud and insincerity against people that trust you, Dante was like, that's the worst, put that on the bottom, that's worse than murder.
So Dante sent the Pope to the deepest circle of hell.
It's just like Dante's shit list. It's so funny.
Dante's shit list.
I'll read a little bit from the beginning, and then we can go on and read it in English so everybody knows what's happening. But nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura che la diritta via era smarrita. Ai quanto dir qual era ai cosa dura, esta selva selvaggia e aspra e forte, che nel pensiero rinnova la paura. Tante amara che poco è più morte, ma per trattare del ben che vi trovai, dirò dell'altre cose che vi scorte. Io non so ben ridir come ventrai, tant'era pien di sonno a quel punto, che la verace vi abbandonai. It flows so nicely. It's such like a beautiful poem. The version that we're going to read is translated by Courtney Langdon, and he basically was like, I'm not gonna do that. Like, I would rather keep the spirit of the poem and the meaning closer to the reality than try and copy the rhyme scheme. Even though it's super cool, I think that like getting the words close is more important than copying the rhyme scheme.
The rhyming lines, they're usually pairs. Or like in the first one, it's like vita oscura smarrita, and like vita and smarrita. Smarrita means lost. So life lost, which kind of is building up to a certain, not only obviously image and like certain emotion, but also it is setting a context of where Dante is supposed to be, the words that rhyme specifically. Very deliberate rhyme choices that's supposed to create not only an image, but also, how do I say, Dante's progression into, like, it's like Dante's pairing of his feelings and his situation.
And it's just so cool that it continues throughout the entire piece. Like it continues through the Inferno, through Purgatory, through like I think even like the second to last line of Inferno rhymes with the first line of Purgatory. Like it continues all the way through. And it's just really cool. Like I know when we did sonnets, we were like, don't worry about form, it doesn't matter. But I feel like the form in the Inferno is both like kind of a meditative, artistic ideal that Dante was working towards, but it also it does a lot in terms of structure and in terms of like the context of the piece that is really cool, but like we don't need to worry about it because we're reading it in English. Murad, I feel like you should have read it though because your pronunciation is way better than mine.
Oh, you did very well.
I can't roll my R's.
It's okay.
It's so bad. I should just do like the R Moshe like they do in like Lombardy.
Wait, what is that?
It's like when they do
the shit.
Like Inferno.
Inferno. Really? I know. I've heard the shit R before. The from Florence.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're saying L, they say shit. Sometimes R is a shit. I don't understand the way they speak. But to be honest with you, accents are fascist.
Whoa.
Yeah. Or maybe when you read, I'll just go like every now and then I'll go every time you read. And then we'll edit those in.
Edit those in. Yeah, perfect. Nobody will notice.